Greetings! I'm so glad you could join me today. Today we're going to be talking about the topic of the biblical Apocrypha. Now, that is a collection of ancient books that is sometimes part of the Old Testament and sometimes part of a middle section called the intertestamental writings, and often not part of the Bible at all. That seems a little weird, right? To have sections of the Bible that sometimes fall in different places and sometimes may not be in it whatsoever. Now, that word, Apocrypha, means hidden, because these books at times have seemed to be hidden. Now, it's more so that these books, or number of books that we consider to be hidden, aren't the same for every branch of Christianity. Some branches have them in their Bible, and others don't. It just depends. Now, just a list of books that are often considered part of the hidden books will appear on your screen here. As you can see, there's a lot of them. Some of them are entirely new books, and others are just endings or parts of other books. They're not the whole thing together. So, I kind of want to talk a little bit about the debate that took place around these books and why some of these books made their way in and others didn't. Now, there's several reasons that books might make their way into the hidden group of books. Some books, like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, come from a time period after when most of the Old Testament was written. These books cover the Jewish revolt that took place when Jerusalem was under Greek control. Now, this was well after the rest of the writing of the Old Testament. So it kind of leaves it in a weird period, a gray period between the New and the Old Testament. This is why a lot of Bibles put these writings in an intertestamental writing section, because these writings sometimes took place in a period in between the New and the Old Testament. Now, another big reason why these books may not be in the Old Testament is they may not have been used by the Jewish people at that time. People saw the Old Testament as the books that were used by Jews, and Christians just kind of adopted that. So stories like Bel and the Dragon, or the story of Susan, or the Hymn of the Three Children weren't used by Jewish people at the time when the Bible was being formulated and created into the nice, neat group of books that we have today. So they may have been left out because the Jewish people weren't already using them as part of the Old Testament. Now, that wasn't the case for all the books that ended up in our hidden section. 1st and 2nd Maccabees was used by the Jewish people at the time. In fact, the story of Hanukkah comes not from the Old Testament, but from the book of Maccabees, which shows that not all these books weren't used by Jewish people. Now, there's still another problem that some of these books have, that they weren't written in the right language. The Wisdom of Solomon was written in Greek instead of in Hebrew or Aramaic. Now, the Wisdom of Solomon also was pointed out by the earliest Christians as not being written during the lifetime of Solomon. In fact, most early Christians assumed it was written probably about 1,000 years after Solomon's death. Now, St. Jerome is often where we get this kind of view of the hidden books from. St. Jerome made one of the first widely used Bibles. It was written in Latin and it was called the Vulgate. And before any of these books that had these kind of problems with them, he introduced a small prologue that talked about that problem before those sections of the Bible. Now, the Vulgate was the official Latin translation of the Bible. It was made in the late 4th century, mainly just by St. Jerome. This Bible became the main Bible used by the Catholic Church, and many years later, after it had already been officially used, it became the single official use at the Council of Trent in the 16th century. But as I said, this was really just more of an affirmation of something the church was already doing. This Bible stayed the official Latin version of the Bible for the Catholic Church until 1979, when a Nouvelle Vulgata was created. But even this new version keeps a lot of the original Vulgate. Just more realigns the translation with the original Hebrew and Greek in more of a classical style of Latin. Now, as I said earlier, St. Jerome had all of these books in his Bible. But what I didn't say is he placed all of these hidden books inside of the Old Testament. So they weren't in a separate section. They were clear right there. They weren't hidden at all. Now, he did have the prologues that discussed the problems with them, especially the ones that weren't used by the Jewish people as before. And he said things that they might not be as good or as clear as other books of the Old Testament. Jerome had a little bit of caution with these books, but he still held them to be Scripture, and he placed them in the Bible. Now, this idea continued for centuries. In fact, the first Bible made on the printing press, the Gutenberg Bible, had these hidden books placed right inside of the Old Testament, just like Jerome's Vulgate did. But as Protestant scholarship grew, so did questions about these books and how their pedigrees weren't quite as solid as the other books in the Old Testament. The King James Bible, the one that so many Protestant fundamentals point to as the only Bible, removed these questionable books from the Old Testament and put them in their own separate section, that intertestamental section of the Bible between the Old and the New Testament. But the final nail in the coffin for these hidden books was laid by the English Puritans. They approached that these books, with their own rational and logical thinking, should not be included at the Bible at all. They were determined that these books were not divinely inspired, and removed them completely, doing away with the idea that they should be put in their own separate section. Later on, the King James Version of the Bible was actually reworked, and this section was taken out. So it was just the Old Testament and the New, and there was no more intertestamental piece. The English Puritans said in their Westminster Confession of Faith, the books called the Apocrypha are not being of divine inspiration. They are not part of the canon of Scripture, and therefore are of no authority in Church of God, nor to be otherwise approved or made use of other than human writings. Now, we as disciples of Christ come out of a tradition that is similarly followed in the English Puritans' footsteps. In fact, it's hard in the U.S. today to find a Bible with that intertestamental piece inside of it. Most major Protestant groups here don't use them, so they're not in our Bibles. In fact, when I was at college, there was a Catholic woman that I met that got a Bible from her father for going to college, and she was very upset because it was missing some of the books that she had, because her dad could not find one with these books in it. But luckily, the number of Bibles with this intertestamental set of literature is on the rise. If you go to some Christian stores now, you might be able to find one with it. And if you want, you can always read these books online. So, I hope that you've learned a little something about these hidden books of the Bible, something that you may not have known before. And if you want to, look at any of the books that I showed you earlier that fall in these hidden sections and read one or two of them and see what they have to say about themselves. Thank you. Hope you tune in next time. Apocrypha. All right, I'm just going to restart and cut this whole first part off. Apocrypha. I got it right, and then I messed.